Welcome. Now sit down, because what I'm about to tell you will give you chills.
Some people say a child's laughter is one of the purest things in life. I thought so too, until I heard a laugh. That came from nowhere. Not from the earth, not from the sky, not from any living throat. A light, joyful sound, but one that seemed to have passed through something rotten before reaching me. A laugh that mocked death itself, and worst of all, was laughing at me. This story begins on a cold September night in rural Indiana when I took a job nobody wanted. Gravedigger. Night. Shift. Miserable pay. But when you have no one else in the world and have to choose between sleeping on a park bench or beside the dead, the latter seems safer. The cemetery was called Restfield Memorial. Nice name, right? But everyone there used a different one, the Stone Silence, and it wasn't just a nickname. It was almost a warning. That place had an air of heaviness, a silence that wasn't empty. It was dense, ancient, as if the things buried there still had something to say, but were waiting for the right moment to do so. My first shift was straight to the point, preparing the burial of a lonely man. No wake, no flowers, just the casket, me, and the wind. I buried the old man as protocol dictated. I did everything right. But when I finished shoveling the last shovel of dirt and lay down to rest, I heard a laugh, childlike, crystal clear, but with something wrong. A distortion, as if someone were trying to imitate a child's sound, but deliberately misjudged the tone. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. The source of the sound seemed to be coming from there, right behind the tomb number 17. Look, I've heard a lot of strange things in this life, but there's something about laughter that doesn't belong to a body, that messes with your mind in a way that's hard to explain. And in that moment, I felt like if I took one more step in that direction, there was no turning back. But I did. And what I found behind that tomb was just the first warning. If you've made it this far, you've already realized this isn't just any story. So if you enjoy true, dark, and logic-defying stories, take advantage and subscribe to the channel. It helps me continue bringing you stories like this. Oh, and leave a like if this beginning has already hooked you. There's still much more to come. I didn't sleep well that night. The image of Tomb 17 remained vivid in my mind, as if it had its own presence, a kind of hidden consciousness. And that laugh, too sweet to be childish, yet too disturbing to be forgotten, echoed whenever my eyes closed. I reached the cemetery before sunrise. I needed to see it again, with light, with clarity, to convince myself that it had all been just fatigue or imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. In the daylight, the tomb looked older. Moss covered much of the inscriptions, and the ground behind it seemed disturbed. I bent down to examine it more closely. That's when I found it. A wooden cart with a broken wheel, a charred teddy bear, and an armless doll with a scribbled face and staring eyes. No children's graves had been recorded in that area. I consulted the map and the records. All adults, all elderly. Those toys belonged nowhere, or perhaps they belonged somewhere no one dared remember. I took the objects to the storage room, locking them in a cabinet. But before I could turn away, a long-time employee approached. Seeing what I was carrying, he paled. "Where did you get this from?" he whispered. And when I mentioned Tomb 17, he shook his head, fear in his eyes. "They've already buried those toys, but they always come back." That phrase haunted me all day, and that night the sound returned. The laughter, now clear, was no longer coming from the cemetery. It was coming from the locked closet. The padlock was intact, but the door shook. I returned to the grave. The stroller was there, on the headstone, and beside it, the doll, smiling. It was real, and in that moment I realized this was no longer a warning. It was a call. And what happened the next night was when fear took shape. It gained a voice, and it began calling my name. Since that night, nothing seemed normal. Not the sound of the wind, not the silence between blades. Even the way the trees bent seemed different. I felt that even when everything was still, there was something moving behind visible reality. And worst of all, it no longer stayed in the cemetery. It accompanied me. It was with me everywhere. It was as if it had chosen me, and as if it wanted to play. 3 days after finding the toys, I went into town to buy new gloves. I stopped at a diner, ordered a coffee, and when I went to pay, something fell out of my pocket. It was a red button, the same button from the Locked Dolls outfit. I didn't remember picking it up, but there it was. And the cashier looked at me like someone about to collapse. I returned to the cemetery early. I wanted to find some explanation. But as I entered the room where the toys were stored, I saw the lights flickering, and then the noise began. First, like fingers drumming lightly, then like something heavy being dragged, and finally, a whisper. Quiet but insistent. A thin, childish voice that repeated, "Come, come play." That sound didn't enter my ears. It seemed to pierce my skull, like a thought that wasn't mine. I flung open the closet. Everything was there, in its place. But the voice continued. That night, I heard that same whisper in several places. In the bathroom, on the street, even on the bus, always the same phrase, "Come play." And sometimes a short laugh afterward. I recorded the sound at a dig site. I wanted proof. Listening back later, I heard a child's voice whisper, "You're my friend now." The file name? "We see you." From that moment on, I understood. This was no longer outside, it was inside. And the next morning, when I heard the doorknob turn and wheels roll down the hallway, I understood. The laughter was no longer following me, it had already reached me. And what happened after that was what finally made me fear the sound of my own name. When the fear starts to make sense, you stop trying to convince yourself you've gone mad. You realize that what's happening isn't a hallucination, but it also doesn't belong in the ordinary world. It's something between life and death, between what remains and what never truly left. And I no longer knew which side of reality I was on. After the recording of the child's voice, everything around me began to feel contaminated. The bench, the bathroom, the storeroom, everything carried a sense of presence, as if the entire cemetery had absorbed me, transforming my body into yet another extension of that forgotten soil. But a doubt gnawed at me. Whatever was there, was it ancient or newly awakened? It was this question that led me to Thomas, a former funeral home employee, now retired. The mere mention of the number 17 made him stop talking and look at me, with the eyes of someone who recognizes someone already marked. In a low voice, he told me about a child who disappeared in the 1950s. She was never found. Her parents, suspected, died a few years later and were buried together in plot 17. It ate away at me, and I knew I had to dig. I waited until nightfall. I grabbed a shovel, a flashlight, and a vial of holy water Thomas had given me with a cryptic warning. "It won't stop, but it will slow it down." I dug around the edges of the grave, without touching the center, and after 2 hours, I found something. Children's bones wrapped in an old blanket, headless. Beside them, the toy car, the same toy. I reacted instinctively. Reburying everything, I called the police. The next morning, they dug up the same spot. It was empty, no bones, no sign. But finally, a police officer called me over. He pointed to the headstone. Now there were 3 names. The last one, Elliot, 1953, the one who played alone. It hadn't been there before, but it seemed like it had always been there. And that same night, laughter didn't come alone. It brought company. After that day, everything I'd understood as reality began to slowly unravel, like an image left in the rain. The headstone bearing the child's name, the missing body, the silence of the police, everything seemed part of a narrative I'd never written, but of which somehow I was the protagonist. And the scariest thing was realizing that the more I tried to push it away from my life, the more it clung to me, as if I'd been waiting for this moment for decades. The laughter began to change. It was no longer just sounds in the dark. It took on a rhythm, a pattern, almost as if there was a song behind it, made of overlapping laughter. Different voices emerged. Some sounded like small children, others like old things, broken inside. It was as if I were in the center of an invisible park, surrounded by eyes I couldn't see, but watching me with the kind of hunger you feel. Not for a visitor, but for prey. One particular night, I had a nightmare about a faceless child holding my hand inside a grave and begging me not to leave her alone. When I woke up, still sitting in bed, I noticed fresh dirt on the sheets. And when I left the room, the stroller was there, always the same. I began to lose track of time. Days and nights blurred together. Figures of children began to emerge from the shadows of the cemetery. Some wore dirty, torn clothes. None of them had eyes, just deep, dark holes. I decided to flee. I got into the car, trembling, but the radio, turned off for months, turned on by itself. A childish voice asked, "You promised to play? Why are you leaving?" In the back seat were the toys and a notebook. On the last page, a drawing, a headless child holding hands with a man wearing the same uniform as me. I returned to the cemetery. I became part of it. And the next morning, a new headstone appeared, with my name and my date of death. 3 days later, that night the laughter came again, but this time it was mine. I can't say exactly how much time has passed since that night. The days have lost their meaning. The light no longer affects me as it once did. And the sound of laughter, well, it hasn't stopped. It's just changed location. Now it doesn't just echo through the tombs or the cemetery corridors. It lives within me, in my thoughts, in the silence between one blink and the next. It's as if, in trying to understand what lay behind that tomb, I've opened a door. Not an ordinary door, but one that should never have been touched. Once opened, it never closes again. Today, I continue working here. At least that's what they think. I walk among the graves, talk to the living, smile when someone asks where their great-aunt or distant grandfather's grave is, but inside me, everything is already buried. Because after what I've lived, what I've heard, what I've felt, I understood that some places don't just hold bodies. They hold echoes. They hold unfulfilled pacts. They hold what no one had the courage to bury. And if you think all of this was disturbing, then you should know that Plot 17 isn't the only one. 3 days after that event, 2 twin brothers were buried in Plot 18, a quick wake without much ceremony. But during the burial, something happened. Something that made me freeze inside, and something I've never forgotten. Because that day, as one of the coffins was slowly lowered into the grave, the other moved. If you're ready to hear what came next, click on the next episode, because the joke, it's not over yet. I didn't believe in these things. And to be honest, I still tried to convince myself that what I experienced was just a series of coincidences, although nothing inside me believes it anymore. When I started the night shift at Holyoke Cemetery, here in a forgotten little town in Pennsylvania, all I wanted was a steady job, silence, and distance from people. Nothing more. No ghosts, legends, or voices in the wee hours, Just a shovel, a coffin, and as little interaction as possible. But from that first night, I realized that this cemetery wasn't like the others, and that the silence I'd been searching for wasn't exactly what I'd imagined. The oldest overseer, a man named Ernie, the kind who looks sculpted by time itself, with his sun-thick skin and his eyes worn with wonder, took me aside on the very second night. No joke, no smile, no intention of causing fear. He simply looked me in the eye and said, "If you ever hear laughter among the graves, don't leave, don't run. Go straight to the chapel, pray, and wait it out." I laughed. Of course I laughed. I thought it was some kind of welcoming ritual, but the way he fell silent afterward, how he lowered his eyes and fell silent, that was when something inside me knew he wasn't joking. That same night, while cleaning an old area, I passed a headstone with a statue of a decapitated angel. It was the children's section. Hundreds of tiny graves, weathered plastic flowers, and toys forgotten by time. A part of me felt a strange discomfort, a cold chill that started in my stomach and crept up to the back of my neck. But I attributed it to the cold wind. And I continued on, but deep down I already felt something watching me. And what I saw days later would forever change what I thought was just work. But before that happened, a laugh, yes, a laugh, would come first. And it didn't come from an ordinary place. Have you ever heard a child laughing in a place where no child should be? It was a Friday night. When everything began to spiral out of control, the sky was covered in dense clouds, and a low mist began to form between the tombstones as if the ground were breathing silently. I'd been working the graveyard shift for a few weeks now, and despite some mild strangeness, like feeling chills when passing certain graves or hearing unexplained metallic sounds, I still maintained a skeptical attitude. After all, gravediggers working alone in isolated cemeteries don't have the luxury of a vivid imagination. The mind needs to be sober, cool, and aligned, or you'll freak out. And that night I swore to myself it was no big deal, but I was wrong. Very wrong. About 2 hours into my shift, I made my way to the West Sector, an area rarely visited, filled with ancient graves with faded names and moss-covered crosses. The silence was so profound you could hear your own blood pounding in your ears, until, suddenly, it was broken. From behind a crooked tree came a soft, subtle, but unmistakable sound. A laugh. A childish laugh. Short, as if the child were enjoying something only they could see, and as absurd as the idea was, my body reacted with an immediate shiver. I turned around. Nothing. No figure. No movement. Just that strange echo reverberating between the headstones, as if the stones were trying to repeat the sound on a delayed basis. I stood there for a few seconds, staring into space, trying to rationalize. It could have been a cat, a forgotten toy, a sound coming from a nearby house, but the cemetery was surrounded by brush and distance. The nearest houses were more than 500 meters away, and at that hour, there was no reason for anyone to be there, least of all, a child. I approached slowly, listening to each footstep in the wet grass. When I reached the tree, I noticed small footprints, bare apparently, in the damp earth, leading toward a section of the stone wall. I continued with the flashlight, my heart racing as if something inside me knew I shouldn't go any further, but I kept going. I came to a broken grave, its cement lid partially sunken and clearly unmarked, and that's when I heard it again. The same laughter, only this time came from within, yes, from inside the tomb. The flashlight trembled in my hand. The air grew heavy as if time had stopped. I wanted to run, I swear I did, but my legs wouldn't obey. They locked up. Because my brain was still trying to find a logical explanation, but my body already knew. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. I had never felt so much fear and curiosity at the same time, because deep down, a part of me wanted to look again. I wanted to confirm if it had really happened. And that's why I went back there the next night. Only this time, I didn't go alone. When I woke the next morning, it felt like the previous night hadn't ended. It was as if my mind was still trapped inside that cemetery, hearing echoes that shouldn't exist. I didn't sleep well. What little rest I managed was interrupted by fragmented dreams, if you can even call them dreams, in which graves opened on their own, and a child with completely white eyes watched me from behind a veil of mist. That laughter, it haunted me even in the quiet moments of my apartment. And as absurd as it all seemed, I needed to go back. Not out of courage, but because something inside me demanded answers. It was as if that sound had ingrained itself in my subconscious, and only by returning to the place where it all began could I free myself. You from it. I waited for the clock to strike 22 before leaving. The city was quiet, and the streets seemed more deserted than usual. The path to the cemetery, which had previously brought me a certain peace, now caused a tightness in my chest. As I crossed the iron gate, I felt that internal chill again, as if the air there were denser, harder to breathe. I grabbed my flashlight, and before heading to the tomb where it all began, I decided to stop by the small, abandoned chapel in the center of the grounds. It wasn't my habit to do this, but something drew me there. The interior was dusty, with the pews covered in a thin layer of dirt and broken stained glass windows that let in the moonlight in a distorted way. And it was there, on the altar, that I encountered something that chilled my spine. There was an old toy, a small wooden horse with a red ribbon tied around its neck. A toy that had definitely not been there the night before. I approached, and on the nearest bench lay a folded piece of paper. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was childish, shaky, as if it had been written with difficulty. It contained only 4 words: "Don't wake up the laughter." I was paralyzed for a few moments. Who could have put that there? And most disturbing, why? I walked toward the tomb, flashlight pointed straight ahead, hands trembling and steps increasingly hesitant. As I approached the spot, I noticed the ground was disturbed, as if someone or something had been digging during the day. Soft earth, fresh excavation marks, and there on top of the broken headstone lay a pair of children's shoes. Old, dirty but perfectly aligned, as if someone had left them there as an offering. At that moment, I understood that this wasn't just some supernatural prank. I had invaded a cycle, a space bounded by forces that don't understand mercy. And when I tried to return, I realized that I was no longer alone among the tombs. When I realized I was no longer alone, it was as if the very air around me had been sucked out. An unnatural stillness spread through the cemetery, the kind of silence that not only silences sounds, but oppresses thoughts, making even blinking uncomfortable. My steps stopped right there, between the chapel and the desecrated tomb, and the only thing that moved was the fog, thick, alive, as if watching me. And then, behind a cracked mausoleum, I saw a small, motionless silhouette standing. At first I thought it was a vandalized child statue, the kind they often place on ancient tombs, but there was something about that still body that told me otherwise. It wasn't what I saw, it was what I felt. A sharp chill ran down my spine as the figure slowly turned its face toward me. It was a child, small, thin, with a dingy white dress and bare feet on the wet earth. But the worst thing, what truly left me speechless, were the eyes, or rather their absence. There were only 2 deep holes, dark as bottomless wells, and from them came neither sadness nor anger, only emptiness. a paralyzing emptiness. She didn't say anything. She just stared at me, and even without eyes, it was as if she saw right through me, my past, my fears, my flaws, everything exposed. And then she smiled, a light, childlike smile, but completely out of place in the situation. It was at that moment that I heard the laughter again, but not from her mouth. The laughter came from the ground, from every corner, as if dozens of invisible children were laughing in unison, in different directions, in a macabre chorus that echoed among the tombs, feeding on my panic. The girl held out her hand. She didn't come closer. She just pointed at something behind me. And when I turned, the cemetery gate was closed, locked, even though I'd left it wide open. I ran toward it like a madman, trying to ignore the whispers that formed on the wind. But when I got there, not only was the gate locked with thick chains, but there was also a sign attached with a rusty nail. "Don't leave." Before the last laugh, my hands were shaking. I tried to scream for help, but the sound seemed to carry nothing. It was as if I had been thrown into a space outside the world, where only fear and that entity disguised as a child existed. I looked back to where she'd been, but now she was gone. Where she'd been, there was only a burned teddy bear, its eyes sewn shut with red thread, and a note attached to its paw. But before I could get closer to read the writing, I heard something that froze my blood. Steps, small steps, and not just from a child, several, and they all came towards me. The next morning, when I finally managed to leave that place, my body exhausted and my mind completely fragmented, I felt as if I had been buried alive by a reality no one else could see. The gate was unlocked, as if it had never been closed. The little shoes were gone. The note, too. No sign of the girl. No trace of the small footprints or the dense fog that had engulfed me the night before. It was as if everything had been carefully erased, as if that experience had been merely a projection of my fear. But I knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, that it all happened. The first thing I did was seek out the cemetery administrator, an elderly, experienced gentleman, the kind with the hard gaze and dry gestures of someone who's seen a lot but believes in little. When I began to recount what I'd experienced, I noticed he wasn't even blinking. His eyes remained fixed on me, but his expression was the same as someone listening to a drunk trying to recall a poorly told dream. I expected some kind of reaction, any sign that he believed or at least considered me, but all I got was a long sigh and a weak pat on the shoulder. "You've been working too hard, young man. Get some rest." And it was there that I understood something no one told me when I entered this profession. Gravediggers have no right to freak out. We are the last line between the living and the dead. Society expects us to be immune to the madness that lurks where no one else wants to tread. If a police officer reports something strange, he can be investigated. If a priest senses a presence, people pray. But if a gravedigger says he heard children's laughter coming from ancient tombs, he becomes a joke, and worse, suspected of losing his mind. We have no credibility, just shovels and silence. Still, I didn't give up. I returned that night, armed with cameras and flashlights, determined to capture anything. I needed proof, not for myself, but to try to protect those close to me. But the cemetery welcomed me differently this time. Too silent, too dead, as if it knew I was prepared. The cameras froze, the flashlight beam failed in strategic spots. Everything seemed manipulated. And once again, the sounds began. But not laughter this time. It was crying. A muffled, childish cry, repeated as if coming from inside a tube, echoing through the roots of the earth. I followed the lament, my heart pounding, like a drum, and my soul slowly detaching from sanity. And then I realized something even more disturbing. The crying wasn't coming from just one direction. He came from several tombs at the same time. After that early morning, I never returned to the cemetery. In fact, I was never the same. For days, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of delirium induced by fatigue, pressure, or perhaps trauma I didn't even know I was carrying. But when your body tries to forget, but the sound remains, something inside you begins to slowly bite, and so it was with me. What I heard that night never went away. That first morning, still in the car as I drove along the dirt road toward town, I heard the first laugh, loud, clear, as if it were in the back seat. I nearly crashed the car in shock. I turned to look. There was nothing, but the smell of wet earth and aged wood was still in the air, as if I'd brought the cemetery with me. Or worse, as if something inside had gotten into the car with me. I tried to ignore it. I kept going, but the sounds began to appear in the most unlikely places. On the radio between stations, a childish laugh emerged as a smiling chirp. At home, while brushing my teeth, I saw the reflection of a small silhouette crossing the hallway behind the mirror. The first time I heard my name whispered, I was lying down, almost asleep. The voice was sweet, but cold, as if each syllable dripped ice into my head. You heard me first. Now feel me. Since then, I haven't slept. With every nap, I dream of the cemetery, but now it's empty. There's only me. And laughter. Laughter that comes from beneath the earth, from nameless graves, from broken headstones that slowly open like hungry mouths. And there's always a child waiting for me there, with her back turned, in a little white dress smeared with mud. When she turns, her face is covered in stitches, and yet she laughs. Laughs as if she knows her time is coming back. And mine is ending. I tried to record the sounds, show them to someone, but the files get corrupted, the images disappear. No one believes it, no one sees it, only me. And maybe you, the one listening to this now, because if you've gotten this far, listening to my entire story, maybe something has already connected between us. Maybe the sound that was inside me has transferred to you. Now I hear her laughter, even when everything is silent, even with headphones on, even in the middle of a crowd. She follows me and gets closer and closer. Sometimes I hear her breathing. Other times I feel her gentle touch on my shoulder when I'm alone. And last night, she appeared in the mirror again, smiling, and she said something I can't erase from my memory. You're next. There are things we see and pretend we didn't, but what you hear in the dark, the thing that breaks the silence when there should be no sound, that leaves a mark on you in a way that's impossible to ignore. It was around 3 in the morning when I first heard it, and I swear, to this day, I don't know if what gives me the biggest chills is the memory of the laughter, or the fact that, when it stopped, the silence grew even heavier. The early morning was chilly, typical of autumn. I was in the cemetery's guardhouse, reviewing some burial records, when I heard a strange sound coming from the back of the grounds, in the oldest part, where almost no one goes. I thought it was the wind, but the wind doesn't laugh. And that sound, it was laughter, a child's, loud, clear, light, as if playing, but in a place where no one else should be. I grabbed the flashlight. I walked out slowly. Each step between the graves made the ground creak, as if bones were cracking beneath. I followed the sound for a few minutes until the flashlight began to fail. The light wavered, and then I saw it. Near the white marble headstone, a small, motionless figure. It didn't move a muscle. It looked like a girl in a dress, looking down, its hair covering its face. I felt my body freeze. I called out, no answer. Another step, another call, and it was gone. Literally, it evaporated before my eyes, and the laughter returned, but this time behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing, just the echo of my own fear pounding against the walls of my skull. I ran back to the guardhouse without looking back, but along the way I saw something written in the dirt with tiny hands. You heard. Since then, everything else has faded into the background. That night has been etched in my mind like a sonic scar. And you might be thinking, maybe I was just imagining it. But when the same sound appears more than once, at different times, in different places, you begin to understand that reality may be more elastic than it seems. But that was just the beginning, because when I decided to find out who was that girl, I discovered that not even the dead like their names to be remembered. And now, things start to get really weird. After that early morning, something inside me changed. It wasn't just a night shift in a secluded cemetery anymore. It had become a silent obsession. I needed to understand what was happening there, because nothing I experienced that night seemed like a hallucination. And as much as my reason screamed for logical explanations, there was an unease in the air, a strange call that seemed to come from the ground. The next morning, I took advantage of a break between burials and went straight to the old wing, where I had seen the girl standing. I passed headstones that were almost consumed by time, many with their names faded, some tilted, covered in roots, as if the earth itself were trying to hide what lay there. And it was there, in the same place where everything happened, that I found a white marble headstone, the same one. But there was something deeply disturbing about that stone. There was no name, only a worn inscription that was barely legible. No date of birth, no date of death, only one carved detail, a small pair of praying hands. I took this information to the cemetery's former caretaker, a retired gentleman who knew every corner of the place like the back of his hand. When I mentioned the nameless white headstone, his face immediately darkened. He said there had been long-standing rumors about a child buried there around 1966, Eloise, or Heloisa. No one knew for sure. According to him, it was a girl who died in a tragic accident. She fell into a well while playing with other children and was missing for 3 days until her body was found, already dead. The strange thing is that after the burial, her mother began reporting that her daughter would appear in the early hours of the morning, crying outside the window. The story spread. The grave began receiving curious visitors, and this bothered the administration at the time. Quietly, the headstone was removed, and another, unmarked one was placed. They erased the girl's name from the cemetery records, as if, by erasing the memory, they could eliminate the phenomenon. But forgetting doesn't mean that something ceases to exist. I returned to the grave that night with flowers. Something told me it was the right thing to do. I bent down, left the petals, and whispered the name Eloise. The wind stopped. Time stopped. Even the sound of insects seemed to fall silent. And for a brief moment, I felt as if someone was sitting right next to me. But the most disturbing part came later, because from that night on, the sound disappeared. No laughter, no presence, just a silence too strange for comfort. It was as if absence had become a new kind of presence. And you won't believe what happened the night I forgot to bring the flowers. That night, the cemetery was colder than usual. It was as if the air had become denser, thicker, almost solid. I knew I'd forgotten something, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Only when I passed the white headstone and saw the empty space did I understand. The flowers. For the first time since I'd started visiting that grave, I'd taken nothing. Not a gesture, not a word. It was as if I'd broken a silent code, a ritual that had been constructed without any prior planning. And yet, I knew she was waiting. I returned to the guardhouse and tried to pretend nothing was amiss, but I couldn't sleep. I lay on the small, old sofa, staring at the mouldy ceiling, listening to the ticking of the wall clock. The sound was strange, as if each second took too long to pass. When I glanced at the clock, it was exactly 3 in the morning. Again. And that was when I heard the noise. A scratching sound. Not on the door, not on the window, but inside the room, on the floor, as if nails were dragging. Lightly over the tile, I sat up slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, and I swear to God, I saw a small shadow pass by the corner of the wall, too fast to be captured by my gaze, but present enough to freeze my blood. I carefully got up, grabbed the flashlight, and searched the entire place. Nothing. Everything was in its proper place, until I noticed something on the bathroom mirror in the guardhouse. It was foggy, as if someone had blown on it, and in the center a small drawing made, with fingers, 2 circles and a curve, forming a smiling face. A child, smiling. My stomach churned. The next night I brought the flowers. I made sure to be meticulous. White lilies and sprigs of lavender. I calmly placed them on the headstone and again murmured the name, Eloise. Silence fell again, but this time there was something different in the air. A sense that I had fulfilled an agreement, an unspoken pact. As if, from that moment on, the exchange was sealed. I offered memory. It gave me peace, but I didn't know what would happen if that balance were broken again. The problem is that as the weeks passed, the ritual became more than a habit. It became an obligation, as if my sanity depended on it. And most disturbingly, I began to feel like she was waiting for me every night. I started having dreams with her voice, always telling me the same thing. You listened to me because you let me in. And if you think that was the worst of it, just wait until you hear what happened when the voice started coming from inside my own house. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Those soft, almost imperceptible sounds came in the middle of the night, when everything around me had fallen asleep, and only the beating of my own heart remained for company. A light, drawn-out laugh, as if someone were playing hide-and-seek. It was the kind of sound I might have missed if I hadn't been so familiar with what I'd heard among the tombs. The first time happened around 2:40 in the morning. I had just gotten out of the shower and was drying my face when I heard a short giggle coming from the hallway. That high-pitched giggle of a child, a very small child, who seems to be enjoying something only they can see. I froze. I stood still, the towel still on my face, as if it could shield me from reality. When I gathered my courage, I went into the hallway. Nothing. Everything was dark, silent, as it should be. In the following days, I began to notice small signs. Things misplaced. Toys I didn't own appearing in corners of the house. A plastic horse on the edge of the sofa. An antique doll, the cracked porcelain kind, on the kitchen table. None of these things were mine, and no one but me entered my house. That's when I decided to check the security cameras. I never paid attention to them, but that night something pushed me to do it. And there, in the bottom corner of the screen, at 3:07 in the morning, I saw it. A small silhouette with long, disheveled hair, standing in the doorway of the living room. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me, as if she knew exactly where the camera was. My instinct was to run to the living room, but there was nothing. No trace, no sign that anyone had been there, and that's when things got worse. Because at that very moment I felt a cold draft of air pass over me, and with it, laughter. This time, not in the hallway, not in the backyard, but inside my room. Eloise was there. Somehow, she'd crossed the line, and I didn't know how to go back. From that day on, I began seeing her in the most unlikely places, in the microwave's reflection, in the car window, in the mirrors, always from a distance, always smiling. But the scariest part was yet to come, because one of those nights I woke up to the TV on. It was static, but behind the hissing there was a voice, a childish, hoarse voice that repeated slowly, "I found you." And in that moment, I understood. She wasn't just following me. She was preparing herself, because the next day the whole cemetery looked different, and it was as if she was waiting for something bigger. It was a holiday. The cemetery was emptier than usual, even for a place where solitude is a permanent resident. The silence that day seemed heavier. Not even the birds dared sing. I arrived early, not by choice, but by a restlessness that had arisen during the early hours, as if something was pushing me there. And when I walked through the rusted gates, I felt it immediately. It wasn't just the place that was different. It was me too, as if part of me knew something wouldn't return the way it came. I walked slowly among the graves, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. And yet, the more I tried to move forward, the clearer it became that the footsteps weren't mine alone. The sound of my boot crunching on the damp grass was followed by another, lighter, more rhythmic, almost childlike. I looked back. Nothing. I kept walking. The sound followed. It stopped when I stopped. It returned when I walked. Then I saw it. A few feet away, the same old white headstone. The flowers I'd left were scattered on the ground as if thrown in anger. And in the middle of the disturbed earth, a doll. The cracked porcelain doll. The one I swore I'd seen on my desk days ago. But now she was there, dirty, with a broken face and her eyes covered by a red cloth. In place of a mouth, stitches. She was sewn shut, as if someone had sealed her speech. I approached, slowly, each step demanding more effort than the last. As I reached out to touch the doll, I heard it, laughter, but this time it was loud, clear, and it came from above. I instinctively looked up at the canopy of the nearest tree, and there, among the twisted branches, she was, Eloise, sitting as if she were part of the tree, wearing the same faded dress, the same wide smile, and her eyes empty, completely black. I froze. My body didn't respond, and yet my eyes couldn't look away. She stared at me, unblinking, as if she were waiting for something, and then she came down, not jumping, not sliding. She simply appeared there in front of me, just a few steps away, and without opening my mouth, I heard the voice, inside my head, clear, cruel. "You broke your promise." I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move a muscle. It was as if my body had been sealed by that gaze, and then she reached out, a small, cold hand, its fingers stained with dirt. When it touched mine, everything went black. The daylight vanished. The sound of the trees ceased. Only a deep, deafening hum remained, bringing me to my knees. When I came to, it was already night, and I was alone, kneeling, with the doll in my hands, and the certainty that something had entered that darkness with me. And it was only when I got home, still in shock, that I realized what had really changed. Deva. Since that night in the cemetery, my life had shifted into a strange rhythm. There were no visible marks on my body, no wounds, no scratches, but something about me was definitely different. It was as if I'd brought a frequency with me, a noise that was no longer external. It pulsed from within. And the more I tried to distract myself, the more it manifested itself. It began with low whispers, like the sound of wind moving through empty hallways. But the detail that gave me chills was the timbre. It was childlike. That voice, the same one that had whispered inside my head at the cemetery. Now it seemed to live within the walls of my house, hidden behind the furniture, peeking through cracks, laughing when the lights went out. On the second day, the mirrors began to react. I saw reflections that made no sense. Sometimes, a figure passing behind me at speed. Other times, a figure standing in the background, staring directly into my eyes, a motionless child with a serene expression and a gaze too deep to be human. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and moved to another room. But the reflection persisted. And worse, it began to smile. The climax came when I got into my car. I was exhausted, my face lined with fatigue, trying to go about my daily routine as if nothing were happening. I started the engine, and immediately the radio crackled. The dial was stuck on a static station, but behind the hiss, something was moving, a repetitive sound, as if someone were trying to speak above the noise. And then I heard, "You're next." I threw the radio away. But it was no use. It wasn't coming from the radio, it was coming from me, as if the voice had seeped into my bones, as if it were part of my breath. The laughter. Now it was born in the back of my mind, slowly growing until it echoed when I closed my eyes. No matter where I was, in the bathroom, at the grocery store, in the middle of the street, there was always a moment when everything around me fell silent. And then she laughed. Yesterday, late in the afternoon, something happened that froze my blood. I was washing my face, trying to ignore what had become my new normal, when I looked up and saw, in the bathroom mirror, a child standing behind me, wearing the same dirty dress, the same stitched smile, and the same empty stare. I turned around on impulse, nothing, but in the mirror, she was still there, and she whispered again, "The next grave is yours." Since then, I've avoided sleep, avoided being alone, avoided looking at myself for too long, but it's no use, because the sound now lives inside, and worst of all, this. Morning when I went to work, the gravedigger who was supposed to be on duty with me simply didn't show up. He disappeared without a trace. And for the first time in all these years, I was truly afraid to open the graves. I'd never liked night shifts, but that week I had no choice. The regular gravedigger had fallen ill, and I was the only one available to cover the wake scheduled for a cold Thursday night. The announcement came quickly, almost too quickly, as if no one wanted to take on the job. The burial was scheduled for the next day, but the family demanded a night vigil with prayers until dawn. Nothing out of the ordinary, until I arrived at the gate of São Miguel Cemetery. The air there had a strange heaviness, and the wind, though subtle, blew with a lament that seemed to pierce the tombstones. The coffin was already in the side chapel when I entered, closed, sealed. A candle flickered beside it, and 3 people sat praying silently, heads bowed. An elderly priest in a dark cassock and pale face was muttering something almost unintelligible. I glanced at my watch. 11:11 p.m. As I took my first step toward the altar, that's when it happened. A high-pitched, crystalline, childlike laugh echoed from within of the coffin. Dry, quick, cold. No one moved. The 3 people froze. The priest stopped praying in that instant. The candle went out. I looked around, thinking it might be a sound coming from outside, but the priest stared at me with wide eyes and said firmly, "You heard it too." And then there was absolute silence. No sound from outside, no breeze, just emptiness, as if the world had stopped for a moment. The older woman stood up and shouted, "That's not my brother!" and ran from the chapel. The coffin, until then motionless, shook slightly. I confess my hand broke out in a cold sweat. I looked around, hoping someone would take over, but everyone was waiting for me, as if I were responsible for something I still didn't understand. But the most disturbing thing is that no one asked if that laugh was real. They just accepted it, as if they already knew. And it was at that moment that I understood. That night was much more than a normal wake, but the worst. was yet to come. After that laugh, no one else dared touch the coffin. The priest remained motionless for long minutes, simply observing the shadows forming on the floor, as if trying to interpret signs. The other two people remaining, a middle-aged man and a young woman with a lost expression, looked at each other in silence, avoiding looking directly at the object in the center of the chapel. It was only when the wind blew again, this time stronger, that the chapel door slammed shut. The young woman let out a muffled scream and ran out. The man followed her, but hesitated as he looked at me one last time, as if waiting for permission. I was left alone with the priest and the coffin. "I need to see," I said, more to myself than to him. "You won't like what you find," the priest replied, as if he knew something I didn't. Still, I went to the side and unlocked the metal latches. My fingers trembled, and the sharp sound of the locking sounded too loud in the silence. I lifted the lid, slowly, as if revealing something that should remain hidden. What I saw wasn't a child. It was the body of a grown man. But the most disturbing thing was the way he was dressed. Children's clothes, as if someone had forced them on. Pajamas too small for him. His face was smiling, a wide, frozen smile, as if it had been sewn from the inside. And his fingers, all broken, but holding something, a wind-up toy, a small monkey that banged cymbals. The toy's paint was chipped, but when I touched it, it worked. Without winding it, it began banging cymbals on its own, and the laughter, the same one, echoed through the room again. I closed the coffin with a desperate push. The priest fell to his knees. "He shouldn't be here," he murmured. "This body doesn't belong here." I ran from the chapel without looking back, but the sound followed me to the gate, and when I finally breathed a sigh of relief, I realized there was something in my pocket that wasn't there before. When I finally managed to pull myself away from the chapel, I noticed that the air around me seemed denser. It was as if the very atmosphere of the cemetery was permeated with something unseen, but pressing against my chest from the inside out. I walked to the guardhouse to get my flashlight and try to regain control of the situation, but as I reached into my shirt pocket, I felt something that was definitely not there before. It was small, metallic, and cold to the touch, as if it had come from a cold room. I slowly removed it, still in disbelief, and held the object in the palm of my hand. It was a button, a childish button, light blue, with the stitching still attached to a shred of torn fabric. But there was one detail that was impossible to ignore. That button was identical, those in the pajamas of the figure inside the coffin. The same faded tone, the same cross-shaped crack in the center. My eyes froze for a moment. How had it gotten in my pocket? I hadn't gotten close enough to the body for anything to come loose. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't bent over, but the button was there. I looked around for some kind of logical explanation, but the cemetery looked completely different now. The streetlights flickered. The iron gate groaned even without the wind. And somewhere far away among the graves, I heard again laughter. Only this time it didn't echo like before. It was closer, more muffled, as if coming from inside my head. I pressed the button in my hand and felt something strange, a sharp, needle-like prick in the center of my palm. I immediately released the object, and it fell to the floor with a metallic sound, too high-pitched for something so small. The mark on my skin bled, a crescent-shaped cut, small but deep. I stared at it, trying to understand. It was then that I heard, for the first time, a child's voice whisper behind me. "Now you're connected to it." I turned quickly, but there was no one, just shadows and tombstones. But the voice still echoed in my ear, and the button was no longer on the ground. I returned to the guardhouse completely disoriented. I locked myself inside as if that narrow space could protect me from something I couldn't even name. I sat in the chair, breathing heavily, trying to find some logic in what was happening, but there was none. It was as if the reality around me was shattering into tiny fragments, and I, there in the middle, was trying to glue it all back together with trembling fingers. I looked at my hand. Again, the cut was still bleeding slightly. I wrapped a piece of cloth around it and tied it tightly, more to convince myself I had some control than out of actual necessity. It was then that I noticed the security camera in the corner of the guardhouse. I'd never given it much thought, but something prompted me to check the latest recordings. Perhaps subconsciously, I was seeking confirmation that I was still sane. I grabbed the old hard drive and connected it to the monitor. The recording was static for a few seconds, then cleared. I fast-forwarded to the moment I entered the chapel, and there I was, walking, unlocking the coffin. The image was shaky but clear enough. Everything looked the same, until something made me freeze. As I looked at the body, a figure passed in the background, behind the benches, short, with long, dark hair, white dress down to her ankles. She walked strangely, as if she wasn't completely touching the ground. I paused, rewinded the image, fast-forwarded in slow motion. There she was, a second child, but that wasn't all. When I paused again, just as she walked down the aisle of the chapel, her eyes were looking directly at the camera, as if she knew I would watch, as if she wanted to be seen. At that moment, the screen went black on its own. I stared at the monitor, trying to understand what had happened, until the screen came back on for a second, with an image that made no sense at all. A child sitting on the guardhouse chair, staring at me. But I hadn't seen anyone come in. There was no one inside. I jumped out of my chair and turned around. The chair was still rocking slowly, and now something told me that time in that cemetery had started to work differently. That night, sleep was impossible. So I decided to leaf through the cemetery's old administration files, a pile of musty folders, yellowed papers, and burial records dating back to the 1960s. It was an almost automatic act, anything that would distract me from the feeling that I was being watched. But a name, hand-scrawled in the corner of a loose page, caught my eye. Adalberto A. Lima, gravedigger. Below the name, in shaky letters, someone wrote, "Admitted in 1983. He kept saying he saw children laughing on the tombstones." I stopped. A chill ran down my spine. I opened another folder, and another. Each mention of this Adalberto brought disjointed observations. He spoke to the earth. He called the bones his children. He was dismissed after an incident with buried toys. It looked more like a psychiatric record than a professional history. I kept digging until I found something even more disturbing. A handwritten story of himself, folded inside an envelope with a strong, musty smell. I opened it. It was nearly illegible. The words were written in a hurry, some scrawled so hard that the paper was torn in places, but the essence was there. He told of nights when he heard thin voices asking him to play. He said the laughter echoed whenever the moon was hidden and the wind carried the scent of burning candles. According to him, 3 graves in particular were avoided by birds, ants, and even rainwater, which ran away as if afraid to touch the earth there. But what most transfixed me was the end of the story. Adalberto claimed to have been touched by an invisible child. He felt an icy hand grab his arm, and when he looked, he saw, to yourself, dead, being mourned by colleagues who didn't recognize him. He described the coffin, the crucifix, even the buttons on his uniform, and said that since that night he no longer knew if he was alive. I dropped the paper as if it were burning my skin. I stood motionless for several minutes, trying to comprehend what I was reading. But something even more sinister awaited me when I looked out the guardhouse window, because one of the children was out there watching me. and I wasn't alone anymore. I returned home at the end of that day like someone returning from a battlefield. My body was there, but my mind seemed trapped in some dark corner of the cemetery, between the empty chapel and the eyes of those children who should never have smiled. The walk home was silent, but not the usual early morning silence. It was a heavy silence, dense, a kind of emptiness that seems to whisper inside your chest. And I knew from the moment I closed the gate that something had come with me. That night, when I finally lay down, I felt the mattress dip slightly beside me. My eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, and even without moving, I just knew, something was there. The sound returned, the laughter, but now it wasn't coming from the graves, or the monitor, or the trees swaying in the wind. Now it was coming from within, from somewhere between my ears, echoing like a forcibly planted memory. I closed my eyes and forced myself to sleep, but my dreams betrayed me. I dreamed of the guardhouse. It was empty inside, but the security camera kept recording. And in the chair where I usually sat, there she was, the first child, looking directly at me even as I watched her through the dream. I felt my breath catch. In the corner of the room, the other three appeared, smiling, silent, a silence that hurt. When I woke, I swore I heard footsteps in the hallway. I got up with my heart in my throat. I walked to the living room mirror to calm myself, and that's when I noticed it. A figure reflected behind me, short, in a white dress, and a smile that should never have been there. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and she was gone. In her place was something written in smudged letters, as if a wet finger had scratched the glass. 3 words. You're next. I haven't been back to the cemetery since, but the sound remains. In my headphones, in the knocking on the wall at night, in the sound of the switched-off television. The laughter echoes. I no longer know if it comes from outside or from within. And you? Can you hear it too? Because if you heard it this far, maybe, just maybe, she also listened to you. Now, if you believe this story deserves to be known, share it. And if you want to continue receiving real stories like this, stories that aren't tales but warnings, subscribe to the channel right now, because in the next episode we'll talk about the gravedigger who disappeared without a trace, after hearing the sound of a child calling his name. And this, no one has been able to explain.